everyone, it's time to dust those time machines and embark on yet another classic adventure of Games of Decades Past. I'm sure maybe some of you have been to my channel for a decade now probably know what this little series is, but for those of you who are relatively new, Games of Decades Past was a little side project I had in 2013 in which each month I would talk about a game that came out a decade before. So, for example, in March of 2013, I talked about Rayman 3, which came out in March of 2003. So, since it's been a decade since, I had that, and, I haven't made any installments since 2013, in reality, I thought to myself, this will be a good time to maybe look back on the past and maybe do another one of those installments. But I thought to myself, how far should I go back in terms of what game I should cover? Because on one hand, I could go back to the 90s, but then I'm going to imitate another YouTuber who does that pretty well, pretty much on a weekly basis. And on the other hand, if I go just a decade back, then it kind of feels a bit off to me. Because talking about games that came out in 2013 feels weird, since all of them got remastered recently, and a really good example would be Grand Theft Auto 5. That game came out in September of 2013, and the PS5 and Xbox Series X version came out literally in 2022, just this past year, so it feels kind of weird. So I decided to go back 20 years to the 2000s because the 6th generation is probably my favorite game generation. There are just so many interesting games to talk about, and the one I chose for March of 2003 is a game that probably I should have talked about originally, but I think now is a really good time, so let's go ahead and discuss the wonders of Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. Pokemania in Israel started, I would say, around February of 2000. That's where the anime started. And I remember during that time, it's when I got the Gen 1 games. I got a copy of Pokemon Red, and later I got Pokemon Yellow. And later in the year, around, I want to say November, is when I got the Gen 2 games. I got Pokemon Gold and Silver. I'm bringing this up because after that huge Pokemon boom in the year 2000, there's been a severe decline, and not many people watch the show anymore or played the games, but it didn't really stop me for really wanting the next installment in the Pokemon series, which is why I pretty much hope that I can get a copy of Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. I remember importing that from the US at the time. And I chose Ruby because, honestly, Groudon looked cooler to me than Kyogre. I love them both. I mean, I think Kyogre is also a pretty cool design, but I don't know, I always gravitated to more lizardy-esque Pokemon, more cool, buff designs, I guess you want to say. There are some exceptions, obviously. I've just been more of a Groudon person growing up. And this was also the first game to be on the Game Boy Advance, so there's definitely a leap in graphical fidelity. But more importantly to me was that all the other stuff they added to the gameplay mechanics, most notably natures, which basically means that if a Pokemon has a specific nature, one stat goes up and another goes down. Like, for example, Adamant is plus attack minus special attack, for example. But the other thing that really changed Pokemon competitively are the abilities, that each Pokemon has their own unique ability that they can use in battle. For example, Levitate allows Pokemon that don't have, the flying type to actually be immune to ground attacks, like wheezing and coughing, for example, which that was a huge change to the meta at the time, because if you all know, those Pokemon are poison types, and usually poison Pokemon are weak to, ground. There's also a lot of other great abilities out there, and it's safe to say there's also a phenomenal roster of Gen 3 Pokemon. I still stand by the fact that Gen 3 has my favorite starter lineup, I would say. I think all of them are pretty decent. At the very least, the Stage 1 Pokemon and their final stages, I would say, are my favorite. I think what also stands out to me when it comes to Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire is how much they're willing to go with just having, mostly Hoenn Pokemon, Gen 3 Pokemon. because there's very little in the way of, like, past Pokemon. I mean, obviously there's, like, the usual suspects. You'll see Pikachu, you'll see Psyduck, but very little from Kanto and especially from Hoenn. And that's actually one of the reasons why at that time I never finished the Pokedex in this game. To this very day, when I was actually checking my save, I was scrolling through the Pokedex and I only had like about 270 Pokemon actually caught, because I never bothered to, like, you know, trade back and forth from, like, the future games that came out. And I remember that bummed me, because I wanted, you know, to actually catch them all. Last time I did was in Pokemon Gold, which unfortunately that battery died, so I don't have the record for it. But at least what I like about Pokemon Ruby, in comparison, is that, yes, it does use a battery, but it only uses the battery for clock events. It actually uses, like, you know, a flash memory, I want to say, for the actual save, so it's definitely more reliable than a battery that runs out in that particular instance. So I'm glad that this childhood copy of mine from 2003 still has the same save that I had, which is insane. And just going through my boxes and seeing what Pokemon I still have that I didn't actually transfer yet, you know, through all the way to Pokemon Home, is really nostalgic. And I'm really glad. It's kind of funny to me, though, now I'm looking back at this game, is that Gen 3 is the only generation we really got on the Game Boy Advance, because 1 and 2 were on the Game Boy, and then 4 and 5 were on DS, so this kind of makes Gen 3 incredibly unique, and that's kind of maybe why I'm more nostalgic to it than maybe some other generations. And people ask me for my favorite generations. I usually say that 2 and 5 are my favorite, but I would say that Gen 3 is probably my third place, because I love the Pokemon, I like the different areas, I just love the gym leaders, I love the evil teams. I like the idea that each version gets, like, its own evil team. So in Ruby you fight Magma, and in Sapphire you fight against Team Aqua, which I think that's a brilliant idea. And I think probably the only negative I can really think about this game is just the abundant amount of water, which I know there's the whole meme about IGN too much water from the Alpha Sapphire and Omega Ruby review from what was it, 8 years ago now or so? But probably, yeah, about 8 years, let's say that. But in reality, I think the issue is not the fact that there's too much water. I think it just should have been worded a bit better. There's too much reliance on the Surf HM, and it's just a lot of surfing. That's more of the problem, and that really kind of takes a big chunk of, like, the end portion. Like, say, from the 7th gym to, like, the end game is a lot of surfing around, and then you only encounter, like, you know, Tentacool and other water Pokemon over and over, and water trainers. So it does get a little bit repetitive at that point, which I'm glad that the future generations fix that issue. Even though it's not a big issue, but I can see why some might complain about that. And of course, I would be remiss to talk about, you know, the infamous, like, trumpet soundtrack that this game has. I mean, obviously, the Game Boy Advance, I love the Game Boy Advance, but I'm not going to defend the fact that the sound capabilities of that handheld were poor. Unfortunately, it never had its own dedicated sound hardware, so it was all done in system, and it sounds muffled, and also uses, like, you know, very, low-quality trumpet samples, you can call that, but it kind of also adds to this game's identity. It kind of makes it unique, so I can't really even fault it for that. Again, even with the limited amount of Pokemon I could catch, I do respect at least Game Freak for not relying so much on the past and, you know, giving the new Pokemon the spotlight they deserve, which some generations did better than others. I think actually that's what Gen 5 does really well, is the fact that it focuses on Unova, as opposed to, like, here's Pikachu again, and Rattata, and all that stuff. It's also the first game to introduce double battles, and I think double battles to this very day is one of the best staples in the franchise. It's being used in competitive battling today in VGC, so there's just a lot of wonderful things I can say about this game, and honestly, if I ever talk about this game in a proper video, I would write a script, and I would do a much larger research than what I'm doing right now, which is literally me talking off the cuff, which is why I barely had any edits in this video at all. But, safe to say that Gen 3 still has legs, and I still think it's a phenomenal game to this day. Obviously, a lot of the stuff were improved in Pokemon Emerald, which came out 2 years later, and added some additional Pokemon that weren't available in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. There's also, of course, other games in which you can get the other generation Pokemon, like, say, in Pokemon Coliseum on the GameCube, you can get a lot of the Johto Gen 2 Pokemon. And, of course, in 2004, we got Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, which are really good remakes of Gen 1, which is obviously where all the Kanto Pokemon came from. Interestingly enough, in 2014, yeah, it was in 2014, I'm trying to remember, it's 15 or 14, the remakes for Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire came out with Alpha Sapphire and Omega Ruby, and I don't know what happened, but something was sort of lost in translation. Unlike, say, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which a lot of people say are the superior versions of Gen 2, which I kind of disagree, because I still like to go back to Gen 2, and I think it has a lot of charm, but I think that it's a very valid argument. When it comes to the Gen 3 remakes versus the originals, I think that even though Gen 3 obviously added a lot of stuff from Gen 6, you know, the main Gen 6 game, like Megas and what have you, and, you know, more story dialogue and stuff like that, and obviously being in 3D, I remember just going back to it once and I was kind of done with it, and I remember just doing more in the original games, and yeah, I don't know, maybe it was my Gen 6 woes at the time. I haven't actually played Alpha and Omega since. Maybe if I replay the story again, I'll have, like, you know, different reaction, but overall, I just like the originals better in that particular situation, as of the recording of this video. So that being said, this right here is Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, and I really hope you enjoyed me talking about it. And before we end this video, I'm just going to put you right down here, or even better, I'll put you here so you can see Mudkip here. Hey, Mudkip. So, regarding games of decades past, I was thinking of bringing it back for a long time now, but I'm not sure if I should do it either in a form of how I'm doing this currently, you know, with like a long-form video where I just improvise my thoughts on a game, or I'm gonna do something a little bit different, actually, and do multiple shorts per month, so like, you know, 1-minute videos in which I can talk about more games in a month, and just be like a short video, because obviously there's some other games that came out in March of 2003 that I can talk about. Besides Rayman 3, we also had Wind Waker, we had Zone of the Enders 2, we had Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22, we also got, right here, I have it, Murakumo for the Xbox, which is essentially like the FromSoft exclusive Xbox mech game that's not Armored Core, which I heard is not very good from the critics, but I heard now people really like it, so that's kind of an interesting thing to look back on. So let me know what you folks want, but I really hope you enjoy this look back of games of decades past. And until the next time, guys, take care.